Elara sat at the far corner of the cafeteria, her eyes glued to the tablet in front of her. Her surroundings, a grand, gleaming, alien university filled with students of various species, seemed overwhelming, but she had learned to block out the noise. It was all just background clutter compared to the knowledge she sought. In a place where advanced technologies and centuries-old traditions were shared, she was nothing more than an afterthought. A human in a galaxy full of empires, each with centuries of history, far superior in every conceivable way. She didn't mind. She had come to learn, not to be noticed. The cafeteria was bustling with students from dozens of different worlds, each race more exotic and advanced than the last. Elara's eyes briefly flicked toward the far table, where a group of alien students, Sykth, the tall, reptilian commander of a war fleet, Koth, the sharp-minded tactician from a species of telepaths, and Vess, a humanoid with horns that spiraled out from his temples, sat, laughing among themselves. They were the kind of students who were always in control, always at the top. And they were also the kind who found it amusing to mock anyone who wasn't in their class. Sykth caught sight of Elara, and an amused sneer crossed his face. He nudged Koth, and then Vess, signaling the beginning of their daily ritual. They always targeted her, one of the only humans on the campus. There was something about her quiet, unassuming demeanor that made them think she was an easy target. Elara didn't react. She simply continued to tap at her tablet, pretending not to notice as the group turned their attention toward her. Vess was the first to speak, his voice smooth, mocking, as he addressed her from across the room. "Hey, human," he called out, his tone dripping with condescension, "do you even understand what you're learning in that little machine? I mean, what can you possibly get from it? Does it even have a language your kind can read?" His friends chuckled as Elara ignored them, fingers still moving over the tablet. Sykth leaned back in his chair, stretching his long limbs. "I bet she's looking at pictures of Earth again. I've heard humans spend half their time reminiscing about their primitive little planet." His voice was rich with sarcasm. "What is it you call it? Nature? How quaint." The laughter that followed made Elara's skin crawl, but she didn't flinch. Koth, ever the tactician, now joined in, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he spoke. "Tell me, human, how does it feel to be from a species that's always been behind? Always trying to catch up to the rest of us? I can't imagine being born on a planet that's so far behind in every way. You must feel insignificant." The group erupted in laughter again. Sykth added, "Don't worry, little pet. We'll protect you, okay? I'm sure the galaxy is a dangerous place for fragile things like you." The mocking words, though cutting, were nothing new. They'd been going on for weeks. Elara had become used to them, and more importantly, had learned to keep her reactions in check. If they wanted to believe that humanity was weak, primitive, and helpless, let them. She was no different from any other student in the university. The alien species that mocked her didn't know her, didn't know anything about humans except for their reputation as a young and undeveloped species. They didn't know what she had been, or who she had been, before she entered this peaceful life as a student. They didn't know the blood she had spilled, the battles she had fought, or the heroism she had led. They didn't know the weight of the crown she had worn, one forged through endless wars and insurmountable losses. But they would soon learn. Every time they mocked her, it reminded her of the battles she fought long ago, not as the meek human they thought she was, but as a leader of a resistance force, one that had defied all odds to defeat enemies far more dangerous than any of these arrogant aliens would ever know. But that was the past, buried deep within her. Elara wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. She was here to learn, to observe. Her mind was the most powerful weapon she had now. Her hands, once stained with blood, were now focused on gaining knowledge. Still, she couldn't ignore the sting of their words, even if they were just empty mockery. She calmly raised her eyes from her tablet and met Sykth's gaze. The reptilian's pupils narrowed, an unsettling thing to see, but Elara didn't flinch. She said nothing, just met his gaze evenly, before returning to her studies. That was all it took to stop the group's laughter. The moment of eye contact was a small challenge, just enough to let them know that she wouldn't be cowed. But Sykth wasn't finished. "Did you hear that, guys?" he asked loudly, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "She doesn't even react when we make fun of her. What kind of human is that? Too dumb to care? Or too stupid to even understand we're making fun of her?" Vess laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "Maybe she's just too proud to admit she's in over her head." The group erupted into more laughter, but something was different this time. They were pushing harder, testing her limits. They had underestimated her for too long. And though she didn't show it on the outside, Alara knew something would snap soon. Koth leaned in, his telepathic abilities sending a silent message to the others. He was trying to provoke her into a reaction. But Alara was no fool. She had fought against far more ruthless and manipulative tactics before, and she would not rise to their bait now. In her silence, she sent a message of her own. She didn't need to prove anything to them. She had already proven everything she needed to, long ago. The galaxy had witnessed it in the form of a battle no one had ever expected humanity to win. The mockery continued for a while longer, but eventually, the alien bullies grew bored. They had expected some form of retaliation, something, anything, that would show that she was indeed human, with weaknesses like any other species. Instead, they were met with nothing. No fury, no anger, no outbursts. Alara was just calm. This only confused them more. They were used to seeing humans act in ways that fit their narrow understanding of the species, aggressive, loud, defensive. But Alara wasn't playing their game. She wasn't reacting the way they expected her to, and that, in itself, was starting to wear them down. Sykth exchanged a few looks with his companions, and they slowly turned back to their conversation, though it was clear they weren't finished with Alara. Not by a long shot. For now, they had gotten their amusement. But deep down, each of them knew one thing: Alara wasn't as ordinary as she seemed. And one day, they would find out exactly how extraordinary she was. Alara's eyes didn't leave the tablet. The words were all she needed. Still, she could hear them, mocking, whispering just loud enough for her to catch. They were like parasites, feeding off her silence, using her for their amusement. Sykth's voice followed Vess's, filled with exaggerated mockery. "Look at her. What is she even doing here?" Sykth snickered, his deep voice rich with disdain. "Humans, the great galactic species. What do they even bring to the table?" Koth, the telepath, didn't speak aloud, but Alara could feel his probing thoughts swirling like a pestering cloud in her mind. His mental taunt was sharper than any spoken insult. She doesn't even realize how out of place she is here. How could a race like hers survive in the cold reality of space? The words were nothing new. Alara had heard it all before. Humans were weak, primitive, and not built for space. Everyone knew that. The aliens saw her as a fragile pet, a fragile thing that couldn't even fathom the struggles they'd endured in the name of galactic conquest and survival. They saw her species as a mistake of nature, an afterthought on the galactic stage, and nothing more than a curiosity. "Maybe she thinks she's special," Vess mused, crossing his arms. His gaze lingered on her, as if waiting for her to acknowledge them. The little human who could. "What's next? You gonna tell us you're destined to lead the galaxy?" Alara's lips barely parted as she spoke, her voice even, almost disinterested. "I'm not interested in leading anything." The silence in the air was thick. The group paused, momentarily thrown off by her calm response. Sykth broke the silence with a laugh, rolling his eyes. "Of course you're not. Humans barely know how to organize themselves, much less lead." They were relentless, each of them trying to one-up the other with insults. Koth's thoughts prodded at her mind again, invasive, like a needle pushing into soft skin. "I bet she doesn't even know how to fight. What use would a human have in war? She let it all pass over her, letting them think she was nothing but a soft target, a docile creature far beneath their comprehension. And then, things escalated. The pranks began. It started with the innocuous, small, ridiculous gestures that were clearly designed to humiliate her. Her tablet's settings were altered, the language scrambled into a script she couldn't read, something that made it appear as though she didn't even know how to use technology. Her datapad flickered, the screen now filled with absurd messages that the aliens found hilarious. To them, it was another confirmation that humans didn't belong in their world. Sykth leaned back in his seat, watching with satisfaction as Alara struggled to fix the malfunction, her fingers tapping furiously as she tried to restore her device. The laughter at her expense grew louder. Koth's mental nudging grew more insistent, probing her emotions, making her feel smaller. The alien's mental reach was like an endless tether, pulling at her thoughts, poking at her calm. Having trouble there, little human? Vess mocked, leaning toward her. I guess we forget how advanced real technology is. Alara finally set the tablet down, her expression still neutral. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood slowly, adjusting her posture, then turned to face them. The mockery continued, but now, there was something different in the air, something that made Sykth and the others falter for a brief moment. Koth could feel it first. A subtle shift, a faint surge in the atmosphere. His telepathic senses tingled as something deep within Alara stirred. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even resentment. It was something far deeper. It was a calm certainty, something that was buried beneath the surface of her outwardly meek demeanor. What's wrong, human? Vess sneered. You look like you finally realized your place. Alara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she took one deliberate step forward, her eyes now focused, intent. The aliens watched, their amusement faltering slightly as they noticed a quiet intensity in her gaze that they hadn't seen before. It wasn't the look of a defeated target. It was the gaze of someone who had endured worse than their petty mockery, someone who had seen things they could never comprehend. Sykth chuckled nervously, trying to regain control of the situation. What's this, huh? You finally going to do something? The words were meant to belittle, but they were laced with an odd sense of apprehension. Alara's silence, her unblinking gaze, was something they hadn't expected. The others could feel the shift, but none of them could understand it. They had underestimated her. Without warning, Alara moved. The speed and precision were almost imperceptible, but her hand shot out, palm forward, and the air around her seemed to crackle. A shockwave of unseen energy radiated outward, throwing the table in front of her to the side, sending it crashing into the cafeteria wall. The force was enough to rattle the room, the force of someone who had once commanded an entire war fleet. The aliens stood stunned for a moment, their minds racing to process what had just happened. Then, in a calm voice that sent a chill through the group, Alara spoke. You have no idea who I am. The moment hung in the air. For the first time, the mocking stopped. The room felt tense, charged with something palpable. She had broken the illusion they had created. She was no longer the harmless human they thought she was. She had just given them a glimpse of something they weren't prepared for. The mocking continued, each jab more aggressive than the last. They were relentless, and Alara had long learned that their cruelty came not from malice, but from boredom. To them, humanity was a joke, an insignificant blip on the galactic map. Every comment they made chipped away at her calm, at her silence, until it began to feel like an assault. She gripped the edges of her tablet harder, but her focus remained unbroken. Vess leaned forward, his lips curled into a sneer. You think we haven't seen your kind fight? You'd be obliterated before you could even raise a weapon. His voice was thick with the conviction of someone who believed they were untouchable. The only reason you're here is because you're a novelty. A species with no wars to fight, no empire to build. Just a bunch of primitives hoping to gain knowledge they'll never understand. Alara's eyes flicked briefly to the corner of the room, where a holographic projector buzzed with an assignment update. The sound of the aliens' taunts faded in the background. She could feel the burn of their words, but she kept her focus steady. They don't know what they're dealing with. The air felt heavier as Sykth stood up, towering over her. He was testing her now, trying to provoke a reaction. His reptilian eyes glinted with malicious amusement as he spoke. "Let's see how long you can take this, human. How long before you crack under the pressure? Or maybe we should just tell the others to keep you around as a pet. You might like that." There was an almost tangible shift in the atmosphere. The table behind her had been laughing, but now it was dead silent, as if they all expected her to break. But Alara didn't flinch. She knew how to take a beating. The harassment continued for days, escalating in both cruelty and frequency. They followed her around the campus, throwing insults her way. Sometimes, they'd disrupt her lectures, causing delays and snickering when she couldn't immediately respond. But each time, Alara remained silent. She kept her head low and let them believe they had control. What they didn't know was that her silence wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. She wasn't the frightened, helpless human they thought she was. She was something far more dangerous, and they had no idea what kind of storm they were poking at. But the tipping point came when one of them decided to escalate things too far. It started with a simple prank, one that seemed harmless enough. They'd laced her food with a mild sedative, hoping to embarrass her in front of the entire class. It was petty, childish, but in their eyes, it was just another way to prove the superiority of their species. They assumed it would be nothing more than a moment of humiliation for Alara. She'd stumble, look foolish, and they'd all have a good laugh. What they didn't expect was how she would respond. As the sedative began to take effect, Alara's vision blurred for a moment, but instead of crumpling, she stood up slowly, her posture straightening. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, as if the drug had no effect on her at all. The aliens' laughter faltered, unsure of what they were seeing. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Alara's lips, but it wasn't a friendly one. Her eyes, once passive, now gleamed with a calm, dangerous intensity. She set the tablet down, her hand steady. "That was a mistake," she said quietly, but there was an edge to her voice that made the aliens pause. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And then, without warning, she moved. Sykth had been standing closest to her, his bulk towering over the desk. In an instant, Alara grabbed him by the collar and with a fluid motion, pulled him forward, slamming his head onto the desk with a loud thud. The suddenness of the action stunned everyone in the room. Vest jumped to his feet, his horns bristling in surprise. "What the?" Before he could finish his sentence, Alara was already spinning, her foot catching him in the stomach. He flew back, crashing into a nearby table. The rest of the group froze, staring at her in shock. Koth, the telepath, attempted to reach into her mind, but she was prepared for that. Her mental defenses were impenetrable, her training and experience shielding her thoughts. The effort only made Koth's expression shift to one of unease. He wasn't used to being blocked so easily. Alara stood in the center of the room, her breathing steady. The chaos around her seemed muted, as if time itself had slowed. She wasn't just acting in defense, she was sending a message. To them, and to anyone who doubted the strength of humanity. She turned to face them, her voice cold but resolute. "You think I'm weak because you don't understand what I've done. You don't know the wars I've fought, the lives I've led. You don't know what humanity is capable of. But you will." For a brief moment, there was silence. The three aliens stared at her in disbelief, their arrogance shattered, their smirks gone. They had pushed too far, and now they realized the truth, they weren't dealing with a helpless human. Alara wasn't just a student at the university. She was a war hero, a legend in the galaxy. And they had just made the mistake of underestimating her. Alara's gaze hardened as she turned away, leaving them to process what had just happened. One afternoon, the tension reached its peak. The alien group, confident that they had broken her spirit, planned a final act of humiliation. Sykth had arranged for Alara to be the centerpiece of a public display, a supposed lesson in humility for the pet species that had no place among them. The entire university would be watching. She could feel their eyes on her already, the anticipation of her failure. It was nothing more than a power play, a way to remind her and everyone else of her inferiority. They hadn't expected her to do what she did next. The moment SYKTH and the others made their move, Alara stood. She didn't speak, didn't even make eye contact. She simply rose, her movements slow, deliberate. There was a sharpness in her posture that hadn't been there before. The air around her shifted. Even the bullies paused, their confidence wavering for the first time. The mocking laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. SYKTH stepped forward, still grinning. "What's this? Finally growing a spine, little human?" Alara didn't flinch. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with a certainty that cut through the tension in the room. The aliens surrounding her chuckled at first, thinking she was trying to save face. But when she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming device, a sleek black datapad, they stopped laughing. Alara pressed a button, and the screen flickered to life. The data wasn't anything new to her, but to them? It would be a revelation. The device displayed a holographic map of a war zone, human forces engaging in strategic maneuvers against a massive, multi-species armada. The footage was raw, the chaos of the battlefield clear, but what mattered was the name at the top of the file. Alara Mendez. SYKTH's eyes narrowed, the humor draining from his face. "Where did you get that?" "From my past," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp as a blade. She activated the second part of the hologram, a series of military logs, operations carried out by her during the brutal conflict that had ravaged entire star systems. "I led the resistance against the Lornax Empire. We were outnumbered 10-1, fighting with half the resources you all have. But we won." The room was dead silent. The bullies, the ones who had reduced her to a joke, could only stare as footage from a battle years ago played across the projection. Alara wasn't some naive student. She wasn't some untested, soft human waiting for a lesson. She was a strategist, a commander who had torn apart entire fleets with nothing but sheer will and tactical brilliance. SYKTH took a step back, his smug expression replaced by uncertainty. You're lying." Alara shook her head. "Not lying. I just didn't want to fight anymore. After we won, I went into hiding. The universe was a mess, and I wanted nothing more than peace. But clearly, you don't understand what peace means to someone who's lived through war." The aliens stood frozen, unable to speak, their arrogance crushed under the weight of Alara's revelations. She was no longer the weak human they had mocked. She had been a legend, a commander who had led her people to victory against impossible odds, and now, she was ready to prove it. "I don't need your respect," she continued, locking eyes with SYKTH, "but I will make sure you never forget who humans really are." The silence that followed felt heavy, but it was a different kind of silence than before. There was no longer laughter, no smug superiority. The tension was palpable, like the air before a storm. The alien bullies who had tormented her for so long were now confronted with the truth, and it was a truth they weren't ready to accept. Alara turned to walk away, her pace slow but confident. There was no need to stay. The message had been delivered. As she exited, she could hear the murmurs, the hushed conversations rippling through the room. She wasn't a joke anymore. No longer the prey, she had shown them all what humans could truly do. In that moment, she knew that the galaxy would never look at her, or humanity, the same way again.